the webinar. So a holistic view on SAP HANA Security. As you know, HANA is the next big topic of SAP, or the current big topic of SAP. And there are some differences, obviously, to the way SAP worked before HANA came along. And that brings me actually to my first slide, where we see the different deployment scenarios of HANA. The first deployment scenario, which was basically also how HANA started, was HANA as a data mart. In other words, HANA is all about in-memory. It's all about performance and being able to analyze a big amount of data in a very short amount of time. And therefore, the first deployments which HANA had were BW systems which were using HANA instead of another relational database to gather different data from different sources and then analyze and display them in a very short amount of time to the user. The deployment scenario which we saw next was using HANA as a replacement for a so to speak regular relational database in an ERP scenario. So in other words, it was or it still is an ABAP stack, but instead of a relational database, you have a HANA database on top of it. And some of you might know this scenario very well. I think this is one of the most common scenarios currently. And as some of you also may know, this brings some changes in the ABAP stack along. So in other words, it's not done with just replacing a database. There would probably be less work if you, for example, replace an SQL server with an Oracle database. In the case of HANA, HANA works differently than a relational database, so there are some changes which need to be made, also in custom coding, where some statements, not very many, but some statements will not work anymore in ABAP when deployed on an HANA database, and this is one of the issues we will get to later on when talking about the actual security issues. And last but not least, we have the HANA variant, so to speak, which SAP is promoting heavily now, which means the HANA Cloud Platform as a technical infrastructure, as a native platform, where also native HANA applications will be written for, which now includes several flavors. There's the HANA Cloud Platform, there's S/4HANA, and there's so to speak the hybrid scenario of those, which is S/4HANA Cloud. Not really high. There's also a hybrid scenario, actually, but S/4HANA Cloud is the next evolution of ERP, as SAP themselves put it, which can also be seen by the wording coming from R3. We now have S/4HANA, and this is entirely new business application platform, so to speak. So these are the deployment scenarios of HANA, but the question is, why should you care about security for HANA? It's SAP system, and what has changed? Well, first of all, of course, technical things have changed quite a bit. But to answer the question why you should care about security, you also need to understand the point of view from the other side. So basically, why is HANA important to hackers? First of all, there's content considerations. So HANA does contain business data, similar to your regular ERP or your regular SAP system, which makes it very good espionage target for hackers to retrieve data from HANA. And also HANA is central to business processes, which also makes it a target for potential sabotages. These are the content considerations. So HANA still represents the major focus of your business scenario if you use it productively, your crown jewel, so to speak. There's another consideration why, especially now, HANA might be an attractive target for hackers, which is technology. First of all, due to the fact that HANA is relying more on web technologies than the ABAP stack of the SAP world, there are more fraud possibilities. There's more possibilities for social engineering, which we see because of the user there will be more users who have web browsers than, for example, SAP GUI. But more importantly, I think IT security today has little experience with HANA, and this is something which hackers will consider, which hackers will misuse, and they will try to attack HANA because they know that the defenses are not as high yet as they are with regular IT infrastructure or with a regular SAP infrastructure. So this as a short way of a short introduction. Now let's talk about what risk we have when we see HANA in production, when we see an implementation of HANA. Some of them are new. They're similar or even identical to what we see in a SAP ABAP or SAP Java environment, but some of them are new and actually unique to HANA or the in-memory technology in general. So the first risk we have, and this is actually a risk which is not unique to HANA, it's something which we see with all SAP systems. In other words, you can have an SAP HANA system on the internet, or you will probably have an SAP HANA system on the internet. Of course, HANA systems are by default connected to a web browser or can be called by using a web browser. If that is the case, there's a very high likelihood that these systems are also available from the internet. Of course, it also depends on what sort of applications and what sort of scenarios you're running. But if you have an SAP HANA system on the internet, there's all different types of possibilities for a hacker to access it. And it's also very easy for a hacker to find out whether there is an SAP HANA system on the internet. As with any SAP system, the URL structure is a possibility to check on or check about HANA systems on the internet. A portal, SAP portal has a certain URL structure which you can Google. A NetWeaver application server has a certain URL structure which you can Google, and so does HANA. So it's very easy to access or to search for HANA systems on the internet, which in other words means that also there's unauthorized access possible if you know or guess usernames and passwords, and therefore services can be misused. The big difference which we see between HANA and an ABAP stack of SAP, for example, is that HANA defaults on web pages, whereas with ABAP stacks, you only have a very restricted number of applications actually on the internet, e-recruiting, supplier portals, things like that. But because HANA is focusing on web technologies and includes very many web technologies, it is also vulnerable to typical web weaknesses such as cross-site scripting, SQL injection, or coming more from the SAP side, ABAP code injection. The difference, if you look at it from again from a hacker's perspective, is also that with an SAP ABAP system, usually a hacker would not necessarily know how to attack the system. With typical web weaknesses, there are a lot more hackers which know how to exploit web weaknesses than there are hackers who know how to exploit SAP weaknesses. So in other words, if you want to put it like that, the target group for HANA is a lot bigger than the target group for ABAP-based systems. The next risk, just as an example, is something which has not been reported today, but I think is very interesting possible risk. And also I believe that sooner or later it is something which we will actually see, where we will actually see cybersecurity attacks used this way. It's called RAM scraping. And RAM scraping, in other words, means that the malware or virus which is injected into the system is running in memory. And since it's running in memory only, it's very hard to detect. Because the moment you shut down the computer, the malware is also gone. On the other hand, it's also a very good possible attack vector to use on HANA, because HANA is all about in-memory technology. What makes a RAM scraping so dangerous is actually the fact that in memory, so even with HANA, there's no encryption. When data is loaded into the memory of the server, it's not encrypted. It could be encrypted from a technological point of view, but it wouldn't make any sense because you would lose all the performance gains which you would, or which is the reason why you would use HANA in the first place. So therefore, this is the attack vector which RAM scraping is actually using. It's something which is possible, and there are some attacks which have been recorded using RAM scraping. However, they have not been targeted at HANA systems, but on POS systems. There has been one incident with company Target in, I think, 2013 in the States, and more recently there were some issues with Kmart and Chipotle in the news, which were also targeting POS systems. And those particular malwares were actually only, in quotes, retrieving credit card data for the very short amount of time where the credit card data was loaded into the memory of those POS systems and send them to a external address. But imagine this sort of attack being used with HANA. Again, data on SAP HANA in memory is not encrypted. And also, therefore, it's an ideal method to attack in-memory technology. So it might actually be that we've already that there were already some attacks using that vector, but we just don't know about it because, again, it leaves almost no footprint. And also, I believe it's something which we will definitely see in the future. Now, the next potential risk is also a risk which is unique not only to HANA, not even only to SAP systems, but I think in general to any IT infrastructure, which is basic security. You know, but when we look at HANA in particular, we see that usually HANA systems are running in parallel to existing systems. So most customers would probably start using HANA or start using HANA in parallel in the existing system, and once they have migrated all the data to HANA, they might shut down the old systems, but up to then there's an additional or more than one additional system running in the system landscape. In other words, the complexity increases. Also, if you were to protect HANA, you would have to learn a whole new set of security tools. HANA includes their own role and authorization concept, something which we'll see later on. It includes a new set of configuration settings which you need to protect, and probably you might even have a different or additional operating system flavor which you need to protect. So In other words, complexity will increase. Last but not least, you will have new systems, you will have new networks, and one of the recommendations we actually have is to even separate the network for a HANA-based system, or even for one HANA-based system with different clients, but we'll also get to that later. So there's additional security features which you need to consider in general. In other words, the complexity increases. So if you use HANA, the reality shows that the complexity of your system landscape will increase tremendously, which means more security settings which need to be validated, more possibilities of mistakes, and therefore more higher likelihood of vulnerabilities which are left open. These are just 3 examples of how risks can occur in HANA, or what type of risk can occur in HANA. And now, of course, we'd like to talk about a little bit about how we can tackle HANA security from a holistic perspective. For this, I would like to discuss 3 main topics for HANA security. First of all is roles and authorization, which on any SAP system is one of the cornerstones of security, of course. But there are some difference between ABAP-based systems or Java-based systems and HANA-based systems in SAP. Also shortly talk about configuration issues and custom development, because custom development is also something which takes place both in HANA and in other SAP systems. So regarding roles and authorization or users, it's important to know, well, first of all, there's probably so many topics which you can discuss with roles and authorizations in HANA or in SAP in general. That would probably fill 2 or even 3 webinars just by itself. So I'd only go into these topics very briefly. But there are different user types in HANA, same as in ABAP, but different user types. First of all, you have a standard user, which is sort of the default user, which has different privileges, as it's called in HANA, and which can also access the database using different connections, such as JDBC or HTTP. And since SPS 8, I believe, you also have what SAP calls a restricted user. Restricted user by default does not have any privilege at all, so it does not have any privilege to create or view any objects, and also the restricted user only accesses the database through HTTP. Of course, you can change that later on, but these are the 2 main users which you will probably use. In HANA. And of course, there's also the system user, one of the standard user, which will be installed during, or which will be created during the HANA install. And this system user we recommend to deactivate once implementation is ready, once basically your HANA system is productive. Authorizations, also a very important topic in HANA. And what SAP did is they renamed authorizations, because there's also a slightly different technical concept behind that. Authorizations in HANA are actually called privileges, not authorizations. And there's quite a few different privileges. Object system, analytical repository, those are listed here. You will see in HANA Studio that it's, at least from my point of view, a bit more complex to assign specific privileges to specific users, especially if you're only looking for one particular privilege. It's also sometimes very difficult to find out which user actually has which privilege. Nevertheless, you also have roles in SAP HANA, which are a collection of privileges, and again, some of these new authorization concepts are indeed slightly different concepts. Some, I would say, are just renaming of concepts which you already know in HANA, but it's something which you need to consider and something which you need to look at when you look at critical privileges, especially in an SAP HANA system, and want to find out whether any user has any critical privileges in SAP HANA. Which is a good transformation to the privileges which we, to the recommendations which we see when talking about user and role management in HANA. The first thing which we also recommend with any SAP systems is to secure your standard users. I mentioned the system user, which has extensive right in HANA and which should definitely be deactivated as soon as your implementation is up and running. And to pick one example out of the different roles and privileges, you should also restrict the data admin roles to only those users who actually really need it. We actually created about, I think, 30, 40, 50 authorizations which we see critical in our latest version of System Profiler, where we check on HANA systems which privileges are assigned to which user, where we say, okay, these privileges should really be restricted to only those users who require that particular privilege. It's built into our System Profiler, and again, there's about 30 or 40 of those which you need to restrict. Regarding authorizations beyond that, the way HANA works is also it's more focused on apps rather than bigger applications as you would see in SAP NetWeaver, where you have existing applications which are extended using user exits or bodies or whatever. Especially with the new user interface or new standard user interface of SAP, where you have a lot of Fiori apps especially, you should really tailor your authorizations or your user authorizations to those apps. In other words, make sure that every user has the rights to use whatever privileges they need for the specific set of apps they have, and only those, not more. I think the two other recommendations we have on this slide use single sign-on, and if you don't use single sign-on, or for technical users, establish a secure password policy is something which we recommend for any system, which is recommended beyond SAP, beyond IT probably even, but it goes more into the topic of basis security, and basis security is something which you need to consider in SAP HANA as well. This is an example, or actually this was taken from the SAP Help library and depicts the different connections and modules which SAP HANA includes, and connections to external systems which you can integrate with HANA. And as you can see, it's not the most simple picture possible. So there are quite a few connections. And this is, of course, something which you need to take care of when discussing HANA security. You have to secure, I'll jump a little bit between the different keywords here, but first thing you need to do is to secure the communications of all the connections within HANA and to the outside. Also something which should be part of any basis security, secure communications, in other words, and also, of course, you should make sure that you validate other HANA security settings which are potentially included in HANA. Something I would like to go to talk a little bit more about, even if there's an R missing, is the SAP NetWeaver Gateway. And first of all, this is the SAP, it's officially called SAP Gateway. It used to be called the NetWeaver Gateway. Now it's the SAP Gateway, but it should not be mistaken with the SAP Gateway, which is used in ABAP system. The SAP NetWeaver Gateway, let's stick to that name for the time being, is basically the connection between the back end of HANA and the front end of HANA. And as with other systems as well, you have different possibilities of how to deploy the SAP NetWeaver Gateway. The first possibility is an integrated scenario where basically the back end, the NetWeaver Gateway, and the Fiori or other user interface on top are integrated into one system, into one machine. We always recommend using the second option, and the second option would actually be decoupling the user interface, the front end and the back end, and therefore have an additional layer of security in between those two modules. Other than that, of course, the other security recommendations apply. Secure communications between the gateway, between the front end and the gateway, and the back end and the gateway, and other things. An additional, very highly focused point by SAP when it comes to HANA security is the operating system security. Because HANA is so deeply integrated into both the operating system and the technology lying around the actual database, there's actually a separate guideline from SAP for how to harden operating systems where a HANA system is running on. This is something where you should take a good look at. And also it's something where we as well recommend to follow all the steps which are recommended by SAP, and again talking about our own solution System Profiler. With the latest version we have incorporated operating system security into the solution, so in order to be able to check operating system security in an automated way, but this is definitely something where we recommend to take a good and deep look into. Now HANA is, so to speak, still a typical SAP child, because you would still, couple more things when it comes to securing the configuration before I jump to the next topic. Data encryption. Data encryption, I mentioned it earlier on when I talked about the RAM scraping possibility or RAM scraping attack. Encryption by default is disabled on SAP HANA, and it's a technological reason. It just wouldn't make any sense to encrypt the data in the in-memory part of HANA. However, if you implement HANA, you should make sure that for all other data which are not loaded into memory at the moment, encryption is enabled. So data at rest, the secure store in the file system for those files who are actually stored on file system level, and also, of course, the passwords and everything which is important to security, that everything is encrypted safely. One additional thing which is often overlooked is you should establish a key management for those encryption keys. Very often we see that this is neglected to some point, and the problem, of course, is if something happens, if the machine goes down and you have encrypted everything, which is very good, but if you don't know where the key is, you have a different problem than just the machine being down. Another thing which is important for the big if is logging. So if something happens, you would obviously would like to know where the attack came from, but you can only do so if you have enabled at least some logging. There's different logs which you can enable and different recommendations. It would take things too far if I get into details on those. But you should enable logs in general. You should also restrict access to those logs, so only admins can actually access those logs, because also again it wouldn't make any sense if an attacker would have access to the logs and simply delete everything which he's done. You would still, even though logging was enabled, you would still not be able to find anything. And last but not least, SAP has caught up in terms of security guidelines in the past 7 to 8 years. One of the guidelines out there is a security baseline template by SAP. It's essentially made for our ABAP system, but there are some parts on HANA on it, and SAP is expanding on the security baseline template continuously. So make sure that you follow at least some of the recommendations which are suggested in the security baseline template. Now, the next part, the typical SAP child I was mentioning earlier. When using HANA, you would still have, with a very high likelihood, you would still have the necessity to program your own apps, change applications which are there, to mirror your own processes in your company. So in other words, you will have to develop your own applications. When doing so, one of the more important things is you have to establish a secure software development lifecycle. In other words, follow the development guidelines and make sure that you catch vulnerabilities and mistakes as early on in the process as possible. The earlier you catch it, the cheaper it will be for you to correct it. There's a rule of thumb which will say if you catch something in the development process, it will cost you, say, €1, $1. If you catch it in the next step in the process, the amount which it will cost you will increase by 10, so it will cost you $10, $100, and so on. So the earlier you catch vulnerabilities, the better. And we also recommend to automate these checks, either with a code scanning tool such as a code profiler, which we also offer from Virtual Forge and which is also available for native HANA applications, but also for something, let's call it a development firewall, in the development process as such, functionality which is also offered by Code Profiler. But in any case, make sure you have a secure software development lifecycle in place. We know and we see in our experience very often that functionality is more important to customers than security, which is understandable. But by establishing a process which makes sure that you have a secure software development, you would be very likely to avoid sacrificing security for functionality. Now, when talking about HANA, there's some things which are special to HANA, or one thing when it comes to application development, which is to avoid unsecured packages. So HTTP packages, when it comes to web applications, use HTTPS, and also ensure, following the use of HTTPS, of course, ensure that you have secure authentication methods. Last but not least, also valid for all application development, is a risk-based remediation. We know that sometimes it's very difficult for companies to simply correct a vulnerability. The important thing is that you need to know that you have the vulnerability and classify it according to a risk register. I think this is probably the most important issue there. You have to have a risk register where you see, okay, I know I have a risk, I know that it actually should be remediated, but for some reason I accept the risk as it is. Maybe you want to correct it later, or maybe you just say, okay, it's a very small risk, but in any case you need to document it somehow in a sort of risk register to make sure that everyone knows about it. This was one perspective on looking on SAP HANA, probably the main aspect. What are the main pillars you can look at? But there's also a more high-level approach to security in general, and which is what we call the road to green. You will probably have seen similar pictures with different namings, but I think it's a more or less logical approach. The first step always in a security-related project is to assess. So you have to know what the status of your system is before you can take any steps to mitigate potential vulnerabilities or risks. This is not something which you only do once, it's something which you do continuously, even after the two next steps are going on, and even though this is a cycle, the two next steps are actually something which will go in parallel. We call them stay clean, first of all, so this is the firewall which I talked about. So in other words, you want to make sure that no new vulnerabilities, no new risk occur in the system. And the parallel project is, of course, get clean. In other words, mitigating, eliminating existing risks. This is in that sense, it is a cycle because it's something you would probably do all over again and continuously. But especially in SAP, it's also important to understand where the risks will actually come from. And this is independent of what SAP platform you use. It's independent of HANA, ABAP, or Java. In SAP, what you have is you have configuration, which is a potential issue creator, so to speak. So configuration is something where risk can occur. Custom coding is probably something which is more or less unique to SAP systems, or at least something which is bigger than in comparable applications and systems. And also you have transports. Transports are the way of choice for change management within SAP, and therefore you will have a high likelihood that if issues arise, they will come through that way. And of course, for all of these different blocks, risk blocks, so to speak, we have one or more solutions to offer. We have the system profiler, which is monitoring and validating system configurations for ABAP, Java, and HANA. And as I mentioned a couple of times earlier, with the new release, with the latest release, we've actually focused on HANA in particular to make sure that the guidelines which are issued by SAP, which talk about HANA security, are followed automatically or in an automated way. We have Code Profiler, which is available for both ABAP. So even if you use HANA as a database, you can use Code Profiler for ABAP. There are also some HANA-related test cases which make sure that your code is HANA compliant as well. But there's also the Code Profiler for HANA itself, which takes care of native HANA development, checking whether there are security vulnerabilities in HANA native development. And there's also the Transport Profiler, which will also run on HANA system, which will also be integrated into the CTS Plus transport environment. And what we can also say is that all of our solutions run on S4 HANA. At least we tested them on some specific releases. So even if you run S4 HANA, you can be sure that your solutions run on it. Last but not least, if you want to know more, if you want to check one of your SAP systems as well, we offer a free of charge risk assessment where we come along and scan one of your systems using our 3 tools, and we invite you to use that possibility and see what the recommended next steps are. And with that, I'm actually at the end of the presentation as such, and we have a couple more minutes to discuss some of the questions which have come up, and some questions I see already came up. The first question is about the system user. And it's actually a double question. It's whether there are many privileges which are only with the system user, and whether it will impact the system if the system user is deactivated. First of all, it might be a wording issue. If you want to be precise, it's actually you want to set the system user inactive, so you're not deleting the system user or anything, you're just setting it inactive. But regarding the first question, are there many privileges? Yes, the system user can basically do everything. So there are a lot of privileges which a system user has, which other users don't have. So this is why we actually recommend to set it inactive. Next question is about security or about migration from other database to HANA. How can we control and make sure a correct process of migration? Good question. I think this is not something which you can answer in general. It's something which you need to take a look at in your particular project. So feel free to contact us directly to talk about some details in that. And the second question is whether it would be possible to get a functional document with a list of HANA security checks. We actually are also following the security guidelines from SAP, and we're focusing on, of course, of what SAP says. Having said that, some of our best practices include other settings or secure other settings which are not yet mentioned by SAP. We don't have a readily available document yet, but we're working on it. And if we have something like that, we will definitely publish it and let you know as well. Until then, again, feel free to contact us if you have a project HANA migration project pending. Next question is if your scanning tool follows some guidelines, publicly available guidelines. Yes, of course. All of our tools do. The code profiler, for example, there are several security standards out there which deal with coding security, one of which is the payment card industry data security standard, and some of our customers have actually implemented code profiler because they wanted to make sure that they follow the PCI DSS, is the abbreviation of the data security standards. Very important if you do store credit card data, and one example pertaining to the code profiler, talking about system profiler as well. With system profiler we have more than 500 checks predefined, configured, coming with system profiler, and they follow pretty much every standard out there. SOX, BSEC, there's several institutions all over the world which at least give some guidelines on how to secure SAP systems, and yeah, I think we pretty much cover all of them. In addition, also we have best practices, and those best practices include 10 years of experience, more than 200, no, I think 200 customers, 2,000 customer projects, which we've dealt with in the past 10 years. So you can be sure that, as we say, it is expert knowledge on the push of a button. And of course, the next question is pertaining to best practices for role design in HANA. Role design is difficult to answer because it's very much dependent on your company. We, with our tools at least, we focus on the basis security, but we also offer services for other authorization questions and issues. So also feel free to contact us regarding that. And prerequisites for scanning. I assume this is also relating to our tools. What we deliver are usually SAP add-ons, and looking at the time would probably go into too much detail if I talk about the details on how these would be installed on the system. So again, feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to set up a meeting and discuss the requirements which you have when it comes to being able to scan your system with one of our tools. So again, looking at the time, webinar is over, I would say, and I also see there's no more questions. So thanks everyone for attending. If you have any question, any other question, feel free to contact us, and we'll hope to see you in one of our next webinars or in person to perform a risk assessment or even a project on site. Thanks. Bye-bye.